The president of Ukraine has approved the composition of the official delegation for the meeting with the Russian side in Turkey. It will be headed by the newly appointed Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, Rustem Umerov. The corresponding decree on the composition of the delegation has been published on the official website of the head of state. Representatives of intelligence, the Ministry of Defense, the General Staff, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the President's office also traveled to Istanbul. The third meeting is scheduled for today, July 23rd. The first two took place in May and June. The only outcome of these meetings was agreements on the exchange of prisoners and the bodies of the deceased. Currently, preparations are underway for a new exchange of prisoners of war. Zelensky promised to provide more details later. On July 4th, the eighth stage of the exchange took place. It was carried out according to the all-for-all formula in the categories of seriously ill and prisoners under the age of 25. Since then, Russia has stalled the process, which had become virtually the only result of the June negotiations in Istanbul. And now, TSN correspondent Natalia Fibrig is already in Istanbul. When are the negotiations supposed to start? In what format? What are the expectations for the talks? We can ask these questions live right now. Hello, Natalia. So, I'm handing it over to you. Tell us everything you know.
Natalia Fibrig. Hello, Salamiya. As you can see, I am now standing near the Saragan Palace. And in fact, it is right here today that the Ukrainian and Russian delegations will meet. We can see that everything is already prepared here. Tents have been set up to let accredited journalists through. And indeed, meetings like this have already taken place twice this year in Istanbul. We know that the negotiations are scheduled for this evening at 7 o'clock. This was reported by the Turkish side. We are proceeding on the assumption that these negotiations will only take place today. However, various sources mention the possibility that the meetings could continue tomorrow as well. And indeed, the president of Ukraine has already approved the composition of the Ukrainian delegation. It will be headed by Rustem Umerov, just like last time, except last time he was serving as Minister of Defense. In total, 14 Ukrainian representatives have joined the Ukrainian delegation. On the Russian side, there are no changes. The delegation will be headed by Putin's advisor, Vladimir Medinsky. The Russian delegation also includes the Deputy Minister of Defense, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, and so on. The Turkish side will act as both mediator and host, providing the venue for the negotiations. We know that the Turkish side will take part in these negotiations, and most likely, it will be a joint opening or the start of today's talks. The Turkish Minister of Foreign Affairs, Hakan Fidan, is expected to be present. Previously, he stated that Turkey sees its role as ensuring that the parties continue to communicate. Frankly speaking, no one expects any breakthrough from today's meeting. Last time, at the previous meeting, the parties exchanged draft memorandums outlining how they see the war ending, and these are completely opposite, mutually exclusive documents, I would say. The Russian side, in fact, is essentially insisting on Ukraine's capitulation. Meanwhile, Ukraine insists on an unconditional and immediate ceasefire. The Ukrainian side also constantly raises the issue of the need for a meeting at the highest level, that is Zelensky, Trump, and Putin. Please direct speech.
Zelensky, we are diligently working to secure the immediate release of all civilian hostages, as well as ensuring the safe and swift return of our innocent children who were cruelly abducted by Russia. The crucial and pressing task of actively working towards a comprehensive ceasefire is what the entire global community is emphatically telling Russia. The task of working to organize a meeting of the leaders is something that could bring peace closer. Ukraine never wanted war, and it is Russia that must end this war, the very one it started.
Natalia Fibrig. At the same time, it is expected that the Russian side will continue today to repeat talking points about the demilitarization and neutral status of Ukraine. So the question arises, under these circumstances, what is the point of meeting? And it's quite likely that all of this is still a struggle for attention, for the focus of the American president, Donald Trump. The only difference is that compared to the previous meeting, his mood may have changed somewhat, since this time he is saying that he is irritated with Putin, giving an ultimatum for a 50-day ceasefire and threatening tough sanctions if this is not observed. So it's clear that Moscow also really wants to show that it is not blocking the diplomatic platform. But the most realistic outcome one can hope for today is actually the humanitarian track, because it was precisely during the last rounds of negotiations that they managed to agree on large exchanges of prisoners of war. So perhaps these very tracks, exchanges of prisoners of war, the return of abducted Ukrainian children, maybe this kind of progress will come out of today's meeting as well. So we are staying here and we'll be watching how the events at the negotiations unfold this evening. Solomia.
Solomia Boyarchuk. Thank you, Natalia. TSN correspondent Natalia Fibrig was just with us live from Istanbul, where the third meeting between Ukrainian and Russian delegations is expected to take place. And regarding the forecast about what might be discussed, we have just heard about that live on air.
Lizia Bokovets, Istanbul, 3-0. Now, the consequences after the controversial bill on international support. We will be talking about this and more next. Oleksandr Khara is joining us. He is a diplomat and director of the Center for Defense Strategies. We're glad to see you. Oleksandr Khara, greetings to you on air.
Good afternoon. Hello.
So, let's start with the main topic of the day. That is the possible negotiations in Istanbul between the Ukrainian and Russian negotiating teams. The president has made it clear already this morning a list of people who will represent Ukraine has appeared, and the president, in particular, said in his address yesterday that he discussed with Rustem Umerov the main topics that will be discussed, the ones that interest us. How do you see these negotiations, this third round? Does this, in principle, reduce the realism of achieving peace, going back to how it all started with the idea of meeting to look for a way to start peace negotiations? What are your personal expectations for what might be discussed and happen today?
Well, first of all, I don't actually believe that any negotiations with Russia have taken place or are likely to take place anytime soon. Because simply having a meeting between faction representatives is not the same as negotiations. Negotiations are when both sides are ready to talk seriously and there is some goal, whether it's a ceasefire or a peace agreement. Of course, we won't have a peace agreement with Russia. I hope it won't be like the situation between Japan and the Soviet Union, and, by the way, with present-day Russia as well. The point for Ukraine, in my view, during the first round of negotiations or meetings, was to show our Western partners, first and foremost Mr. Trump, that Ukraine is ready to sit down at the negotiating table to look for a way out of this war. But I don't think that Zelensky and his team believed that anything could really be achieved. The only thing that can truly be called negotiations, and this is a great success for Ukraine, is, of course, the return of Ukrainian prisoners of war. And let's hope that this time there will also be an exchange of prisoners of war, as well as the return of children stolen by Russia. I absolutely do not believe that Russia is planning to even talk about a ceasefire in the next few months, because it is ramping up its missile and drone capabilities. The Institute for the Study of War says that by around November, Russia will be able to carry out up to 2,000 drone strikes every night. And it's clear that for Putin, this is an opportunity to prove that Europe and America have lost. They want to push Ukraine into so-called compromises, which are absolutely unacceptable not only to Ukraine, but also to our European partners. And of course, Trump is encouraging him, because these 50 days are not about thinking of a ceasefire or reaching some kind of agreement. This is essentially a license to kill Ukrainians and, in fact, a way to force a painful decision on the United States so that in the end they will have to radically change their position and start truly helping Ukraine. A positive aspect was that Trump unblocked the process of selling weapons to Ukraine with the help of European partners. Of course, that's a positive thing, but you can't win this war with just anti-missile systems and additional air defense systems, especially considering what I've already said, that Russia is ramping up production and increasing the number of drones and missiles that are striking Ukrainian cities. That's why, of course, Trump will have to get involved in European affairs and decide that it's necessary to help Ukraine so that Ukraine can achieve tangible successes both on the battlefield and beyond it, because strikes on the territory of the Russian Federation are an extremely important part of this war.
And thank God, we already have some successes, but obviously, it's not enough to radically change the situation.
But what could radically change the situation, according to Zelensky, is a meeting of the leaders, and I want to quote him here specifically. He says that a real result in terms of ending the war can only be achieved at a meeting at the leaders' level. But, well, I see your smile. It's hard to imagine now, yes, that Volodymyr Zelensky would meet with Putin, but he has repeatedly said that he is ready for such a meeting. Why is Putin dragging this out? And finally, what do you think will be the trigger? What needs to happen for him to agree to this meeting?
Well, first of all, there has already been a meeting between Putin and Zelensky, where Zelensky believed that it was possible to talk and resolve all the contradictions. It seems to me that at that time, it was definitely naivety and a lack of understanding of the strategic interests of Putin's regime. How does he see both his own interests and those of the Russian Federation? The same kind of naivety was, and probably still is, present in Donald Trump, who believes that with the power of his charisma, he can persuade his friend Putin to, well, actually stop this genocidal war. You can't stop a genocidal war through negotiations. There has never been a single case like that in history, especially when Putin understands that the West is not ready to drastically increase military aid to Ukraine. He understands that the situation in Ukraine is complicated. And especially now with these protests, if you look, all the Russian propaganda is starting to present. And by the way, not just Russian propaganda. Today, I saw a post by Marjorie Taylor Greene, a Republican congresswoman who is extremely against Ukraine. She constantly calls for stopping any aid to Ukraine. And so they present it as Ukrainians wanting to kick Zelensky out of the office, as a desire to end this war, rather than as a specific action by Ukrainian society dissatisfied with the dismantling of the anti-corruption system. That is, for these reasons, Putin has no reason to meet with Zelensky, and also, since 2014, Russian propaganda has been repeating this mantra that Yatsenyuk and President Poroshenko, and of course President Zelensky, are illegitimate because they came to power after the so-called constitutional law. And of course, now they're adding to this argument the claim that Ukraine didn't hold presidential elections as it was supposed to. Of course, they ignore several facts, such as the fact that Putin has never been elected president in democratic and free elections. He was basically appointed by that drunkard, Yeltsin. And I'm not even mentioning the fact that he killed his competitors, so there was simply no one who could stand against him. And secondly, during wartime, martial law does not allow Ukraine to hold these elections. Even Zelensky's fiercest political opponents acknowledge this and relay it to the West. We are ready for and want these elections, but only under certain conditions. Of course, it's unlikely we'll see those conditions met in the coming months.
Well, honestly, I agree that Putin doesn't see any increase in support for Ukraine in this war. And here, Trump is also setting a 50-day deadline, which basically looks like a reprieve for Putin, so he can keep waging this war. And this is exactly where the question arises. How can we actually consolidate, not just de jure, but de facto military support for Ukraine from our partners, to show Putin that there really is determination? Here, I want to move on to the Ramstein meeting that took place yesterday. It was held online. And I want to quote the UK Defense Minister John Gill, who stated at the opening that as members of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, we must step up a 50-day campaign to arm Ukraine on the battlefield and force Putin to come to the negotiating table. And is the conversion into practical action, is it really possible to have such support so that at the end of these 50 days, Putin would actually be ready to sit down for real negotiations?
Well, first of all, once again, Putin is not going to change his behavior or stop this war, whether it's a prolonged pause or a peace agreement. That's why I don't like the framework that our Western partners have essentially set, and that we are supporting. Well, where are the arguments or any signs that in 50 days Putin will finally be ready for this? Of course, some people say, look, he basically failed. They didn't achieve any significant results on the battlefield. I mean, this summer campaign, and that's why Putin might start thinking about it. No, absolutely not. Putin can keep throwing more Russians and equipment into the furnace of war just to show that Russia can't be stopped. Because it's a matter of greatness. It's about their culture, their willingness to bear such heavy losses. And of course, I have to admit that Putin sees the resolve of our partners, that they're playing with this hope for a ceasefire and, as a result, aren't changing their mindset. The usual positive thing is Ramstein and these additional commitments to provide us with air defense systems and other things. But it seems to me that if our partners understood that the war will continue until Russia suffers defeat after defeat on the battlefield, even if it's just a sign that despite throwing all these forces in, he can't achieve anything, then that would actually be a kind of functional paralysis of his invasion forces. And secondly, if the Russian Federation becomes incapable of waging war, there could be a few factors at play here. It could be sanctions that crash the Russian economy, leaving them simply unable to continue the war. Or there could be some kind of destructive processes within the Russian Federation itself. Of course, that's what the sanctions are aimed at. And we welcome the sanctions that the European Union has introduced in its 18th package. But it seems to me that's still not enough. I would put it this way. There are two things that need to be reconsidered. If we're talking about sanctions, the goal of sanctions isn't to change Putin's behavior, but actually to collapse the Russian economy. And here, it's not just about Europeans finally stopping the purchase of Russian oil. Some countries are trading with Russia in equipment that's needed for weapons production. Plus, there are also components for drones and so on. And secondly, Europeans, especially Europeans, need to understand that they have to bet on the war, on supporting Ukraine so that it can win this war. I'm not talking about liberating all the territories in the near future, obviously, but rather about inflicting such defeats that Putin understands he can't advance any further with just the resources he has. And for that, it's not just air defense systems that are needed. Aviation is needed for this. Missiles are needed for this, including those that can destroy targets deep in the Russian rear. Not just our drones and the small number we're currently producing. It's very good that we finally managed to do all this. So, massive strikes that primarily destroy production facilities, that means missiles and drones. The second target is ammunition depots, and the third is command posts. And this will have a strategic effect, not just a defensive one. Even with the heroism and professionalism our air defense shows, out of 100 units that Russia launches at us, we still only manage to destroy, roughly speaking, 75 to 80%. This means that even from an economic standpoint, for example, the same PAC-3 interceptor missiles for the Patriot system cost about $4 million each, while Russian missiles are cheaper. And obviously, Russia can just bombard us with these missiles from an economic perspective. And secondly, in terms of the quantity, the number of missiles the Americans and Japanese are able to produce. So this is an absolutely dead-end path that our partners have chosen. We need offensive weapons, primarily missiles, and air power that can strategically change the situation for the better.
And before we move on to the big topic, I'd like to ask you something, Mr. Oleksandr. I mean the adoption of Bill 12,414 in the international context, because this news has also stirred up the European space. And now the European Commission has said that preserving the achievements of reforms is more important now than ever. This raises the question, how could the adoption of this bill affect international support? Are the statements that international support could now be cut off, or that the European Union could, so to speak, block our accession to the European Union after the adoption of such documents, really true, or are they exaggerated?
Well, first of all, this is, of course, a huge gift to all of Ukraine's enemies abroad, including those in the European Union. I haven't yet seen any posts today from Mr. Orban, who, in fact, has been running a brutal and dirty campaign against Ukraine for several months now. And we understand that he staged the spectacle called a plebiscite or referendum to ban Ukraine from joining the EU. Of course, he will point to this and say that Zelensky's regime is illegitimate and corrupt. Our enemies in the United States Congress are doing the same thing. Thank God, there aren't that many of them, but President Trump might hear them and could actually use this argument against us. Yes, indeed, we might face problems starting negotiations with the European Union. For now, it is actually being blocked again by the same Hungary. Hungary is trying to use the issue of the Hungarian national minority here for its own political purposes, even though this minority is not being oppressed and its interests are being respected. By the way, I am the head of the Council of Public Associations of National Minorities of Ukraine, where I also represent the Hungarian minority. In fact, last year there was a meeting with the president, and we conveyed all the wishes and demands to the Ukrainian government regarding the fulfillment of the legitimate rights and interests of national minorities. And this document formed the basis of the European Union's rule of law roadmap. And it is on this basis that Ukraine's steps in this area will be evaluated. And this is fundamental. In other words, this is the first such package that must be approved by the Europeans in order to launch the negotiation process. And of course, our enemies will definitely include here the issue of dismantling these anti-corruption bodies. Of course, this is a negative thing, even if there is some reasonable point, some kind of optimization and so on in this bill, or rather now in the law since the president has signed it. Let's imagine that this is the case. But still, this means a failure of the communication strategy, both for Ukrainian society, which for the first time since the start of the full-scale invasion, resorted to public protests. And of course, a failure of the communication strategy with our partners, because in reality, things are not as they seem. Well, in any case, the very fact of subordinating independent anti-corruption agencies to a single person definitely doesn't look like strengthening the fight against corruption.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oleksandr. We will continue discussing this topic further in our broadcast. Oleksandr Khara, diplomat and director of the Center for Defense Strategies, was with us on the line.